Uh, so we'll just move right into it. I hate to tell you this, and I hated it when I was in school, but I had to learn a lot of history, right? And you probably did too. Every history class I ever studied in school, we studied about the Pilgrims when I was in the first grade. It continued from there. And throughout it seemed to me like it was all about history, things that had happened a certain way in the past. So it is with great regret and sorrow that I decided to subject you to that in this class. So hang on for just a little while if you don't like history. It's only just a few slides in this whole presentation. How did our country fare during and after the Civil War? That's the question. It's a whole lot of American history in just a few slides. In some ways, what happened here back in over 4 years, beginning in 1861, is exactly what happened to Moses earlier when he came forth. There was a period of time that Israel went through a civil war, and he was Abraham Lincoln of that day, in a way, if you think about it. In America, we went to war to decide if states had the right to choose whether or not to allow slavery or whether the federal government should set that policy. As new states were then added, they were able to decide if they were going to, if they weren't going to be a slave-owning nation. It became a struggle principally, though, between the northern states and the southern states. The Great Compromise of 1850 meant that federal officials who failed to arrest runaway slaves would be fined. The abolitionists who were against slavery stepped up their efforts, and an underground railroad was begun, helping slaves then get out of the United States and over into Canada and away from slavery. Well, about that time, you know, Harriet Beecher Snow's graphic novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, was shocking to many people in the North. They had no clue what was going on down here with slaves and with the people and what was happening in the southern states. When two new states, Kansas and Nebraska, decided to allow slavery, it caused many gunfights between the two factions and gave everyone a foretaste of what was about to happen in the Civil War. In the Senate, an early view of what was about to happen in the war between the states occurred when Sumner, who was of the North, attacked Brooks of the South with some kind of a stick and beat him, not to death, but beat him violently on the floor, and that became the episode that's known as Bleeding Canvas. And then in 1857, the Supreme Court steps in, the justice system. A black man, Dred Scott, asked the Supreme Court to consider his case. He was a slave in one slave state who moved with his master and began to live in a new state that was not a slave state. Still, in the free state, his owner considered him a slave. So he took his case to the Supreme Court. I live in a free state, I should be free. Well, the U.S. court ruled that he was the owner's property and so could not be declared free. And this angered and outraged a number of abolitionists after the Dred Scott case. And about this time in Virginia, John Brown, who was strongly against slavery, attacked a federal arsenal in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Not a good song either, right? I'm sorry. What enraged the southern states was that 5 black men were with him in the group that did that. He was tried and convicted of treason. His sentence was an outrage to the abolitionist movement, but very much enjoyed by the slave states. If only they had TV back then, right? You could see it all happening real time. President Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860, and he made a promise that he would not allow the slave states, the South, to continue treating people who worked for them as property. Now, this caused an immediate separation of the northern states from the southern states. We all have different names for that war. A good name for it probably is the Civil War. My grandmother had a different name for it, though. It was a brutal 5-year war between the northern states and the southern states. You know, there were 2.1 Confederate soldiers in the South, 2.1 million Confederate soldiers in the South fighting a force over twice their number from the North. We were tremendously outnumbered. 400,000 casualties occurred across both sides in that war. The question we had to wrestle with at this point was, when is an act of civil disobedience to be considered treason? because that's what the northern states were saying, and the courts were saying that the South was doing. We were committing treason. We had to break from that union. Okay, American history's over. Aren't you glad? So let's look at Moses. Do you know he had a civil war on his hands? He had a civil war just like the United States did. Korah was a man who was responsible for the ark, the Ark of the Covenant, the table, the lampstand, all of the altars, all of the silverware, and the immensely thick woven curtain in the Holy of Holies. Whenever they moved, it was his job to make sure those precious things got there safely to the next place. He was allowed to take it all down, pack it all up, transport the articles in the temple. But he could never use them at all in a worship service. This angered him tremendously. Why is my claim not good enough to do the work of the priest? I can take all this stuff down, I can put it together, yet I can't in a worship service do anything with them. We should be allowed to be high priests too, not just Aaron or men from the family of Aaron. Now Korah camped in the middle of the group with Moses and the priests. Do you see him up here? Korah, K-O-R-A. See something pretty close though, don't you? We see Gershom and Merari, those were sons of Moses. And then we see Moses and all the priests over here, the one at the bottom, Kohath. If you ever see Kohath, we're talking about Korah, okay? It's the same thing. His family was the Kohath family, but it was they abbreviated them and called them Korahs. Now, a female by the name of Korah, spelled with a C and not a K, was my great aunt growing up. She lived with my grandma Ruth, and she was way older than my grandma Ruth and way meaner. I'm talking about, I'm serious. My grandmother Ruth would never hurt a mouse. I mean, she was so nice and gentle, and Aunt Cora was mean and grumpy. And she had food that I wanted, but I couldn't touch it. You know, it was that kind of thing. So when I picture Cora, I got a completely different picture of him than you guys do. I picture this poor man as being bald and very old, wrinkled, and a woman. Anyway. It may surprise you to know that Moses was of the Kohath family. It may surprise you to know that. He and Korah, the man we're going to talk about today, were cousins. They had the same grandfather. One had a different father than the other, same family, but they were cousins. Let me read to you what I said here and make sure I got that right. He was Moses' cousin as their fathers were brothers, so Moses and Korah were indeed first cousins. Now this gives what happened to Korah and Moses' relatives later in this story some degree of personal significance, even to the man Moses. It wasn't that he was some upstart from some other company, some other place in the group. He was a known person. He was a cousin of Moses, and he had to go through what he did with Korah. Of course, you know a little bit about what he did, I'm sure. I'm not telling you anything new here. Here are some things of note about him. Just know that he was not a descendant of Aaron, and therefore he could never be a priest, just as Moses could never be a priest. Korah wanted the one thing that he couldn't have, and he stirred up some other men, princes of Israel, to revolt against Moses because of that disservice that he felt he had. Here's the work that Korah and his family did. Principally, they were janitors. That's what they were. They did the tear down and the reconstruction time and time again as they can't move. They could handle all the materials, touch them even, and even clean and polish them. They were dishwashers and janitors, basically what they were. Today, we have the term roadies. If you think about a band, they have roadies, and roadies come along and do all that work too. They pick up the microphones and everything else that's needed and store it away and take it out again. So these guys really were roadies. That's about pretty much what they were. Their complaint was this: we are descendants of Aaron. We like the descendants of Aaron. Did they descend from Aaron, by the way? No, well, they didn't. Should be allowed to be priests. Again, it would be like the roadies wanting to perform at the next concert. That wasn't going to happen. The three prime conspirators who followed Korah were Dathan, Abiram, and a third man named On, who had a brother named Oph and a sister named Gess. So God commanded Dathan and Abiram to come before him, and On, the third conspirator, wasn't called. They all got together and decided, yeah, Moses wants to see us, but we're not going to go see him. We don't have to do what he wants us to do. They felt that Moses was lording it over them and treating them like they were slaves. And they said, why should we come? Just because he called? No. They chose not to come. Was that a good thing for them to do? That angered God. Moses commanded both priests and followers of Korah to come tomorrow for a test. Everybody, the normal priests and the sons of Korah, would come, and they would all bring fire, and they would present it on the altar. And whoever God picked would be fine with him, he said. Well, you know the story. You know what happened. The complainers gathered at the appointed time, and the glory of the Lord appeared. Then God told Moses and Aaron and their descendants to move away from them, separate yourself from these men, and I will put an end to them. How did Moses feel about that? God said, I will put an end to them. I told you earlier he was their cousin. I imagine he didn't feel too good about that. Well, Moses and Aaron fell prostrate before God. They laid completely down, smacked their heads against the earth, and prayed, why are you going to be angry with all of us, Lord, when only a few have sinned? Well, God relents and warns the people, still get away from them, and he would rid themselves of the troublemakers. This would be the Reubenites, who felt the same way as Korah and his group. There were a few of them who also gathered with Korah. It wasn't just Korah's family, but also the Reubenites. They also felt like we should be able to do the same thing that Moses has been doing. Well, quickly, the called out groups were separated. People moved away, just like you or I would if we were told something like that's about to happen. And what happened next was really unbelievable. The ground split, and the family of Korah, along with the Reubenite families of Dathan and Abiram, were swallowed by an earthquake. And what happened following this was also outstanding. While we're looking at this, let me ask you one question. Do you think that wiped out the whole family of Korah, and there would be no Korahites after that? Korahites? Well, some people thought it did, but we'll look at that in a second. The rest of the 250 men who didn't get swallowed by the earthquake came to Moses and complained, and who came to Moses to complain were also then burnt up with fire from heaven. Altogether, that had to be a devastating day if you were watching it, right? You see the earth opening, several people falling, quite a few people falling down in there, and the earth closing on top of them. And then to see everybody else who was fussing about that happening get burned up by fire. God has a weird way of doing things in our way of thinking, but to him it's decidedly purposeful. It sets a good message for us. He wants us to do what he tells us to do. The following day, the Bible says, all of Israel grumbled against Moses. You would expect them to, right? What they just witnessed the day before. They came to Moses and said, you kill the Lord's people. And God said, I have had enough. And he told Moses, he didn't tell Moses anything. Immediately, as soon as God heard them do that, a wave of death began to happen among the Reubenites, because, like I said, they wanted the thing just like the Korah, the family of Korah did. And wailing could begin to be heard and just ripple all the way through the community. Aaron, quick thinking as he is, and a whole lot faster than big old fat Moses, he grabbed a censer and he began to run to where the camp of Reuben was, and he took that censer and started using it, and he sanctified some people. He kept them from dying, but he couldn't keep everybody from dying. Remember the story of the prodigal son? What was weird about the father when he saw the prodigal? He ran, right? It says Aaron did the same thing. Shame for him, he probably showed his legs the whole time he was running, trying to get to that camp as fast as he could. So Aaron's, he ran to atone for them, but before he could get there, 14,700 people died. if he'd been faster on his feet, if he had a pair of Nikes maybe, if he'd been practicing running and had a good track and field record, maybe he could have got there and forestalled some of that. But by the time he got there, he was able to sanctify a handful of people. Still, 15,000 people died that day. That's a large part of the number of the Israelites. 15,000 people. God told Moses that he, God, would pick who would be the leader. Because prior to this, there were others who came to Moses and asked, "Why are you the leader?" That was one of the questions that was on the docket that day. Why are you the leader? What did, like my sisters used to say to me all the time, why do you the one to get to tell me what to do? And that's the way they felt. All the tribe leaders and Aaron provided their staffs, gave them to Moses, and Moses took the staffs and put them in the tent of meeting and kept them there overnight. And the next morning, Aaron, they actually put them in the ark, put them inside the Ark of Covenant. It was that they had that, put those in there. And the next morning when they took them out, one of those staffs had budded. It actually had olive blooms on it, like you see in this picture. And that staff was the staff of Aaron. God was reinforcing that I want Aaron to be the one that's responsible for that. Quit your grumbling. And everybody left and went fearfully back to their camps. They'd seen God do some amazing things. Now, after this event, Aaron and his priestly descendants would bear the responsibility of all the priests and Levites. And we see on this day, of Day of Atonement, when the priests offer sacrifice for their sins before. So in other words, the priests are going to bear the sins. The sins are on them. They're also on the people, but the sins are on Aaron as well and the priests. So they are the ones that have to ask God's forgiveness first and get cleansed before they can ask God to cleanse the others. No one else could set one dusty hair on one toe of one foot inside the tabernacle when the Levites would go in and do the work that they did. Tithes and offerings were created to be used to support the families of these people, since they could not work. Their work was taking care of the tabernacle and all the implements that were in there. So here's what you may not know, but what Paul Harvey obviously knew. He knew the rest of the story. While the family of Korah were all killed in the earthquake, some of his descendants must have survived. Not all of the family of Korah died when the earthquake opened and covered them back up. You know, Samuel, believe it or not, he was a Kohathite. He was of the line of Korah through his father Elkanah. After the Israelites were in place in Palestine, after the wandering under Moses, the family of Korah became doorkeepers and custodians in the temple. That was when there was no longer need for them to haul any of that stuff anywhere. They took over the job of polishing it, putting it in the right place, and washing the dishes when things needed to be washed, that kind of stuff. That's continued to be what they did. Now, during the time of King David, we know a few people. Some of his mighty men, warriors for King David, were of the tribe of Korah, the Kohathites. But even at the time of David, many years after Moses, the sons of Korah were especially known for the creation of what? We know them today, folks. I didn't look to see. It's possible we could have even been influenced by Korah today. I can look back over it and tell you, I think. Many of the Psalms were written by Kohathites and attributed to them. Many of the Psalms, many of the songs that we sing, many of the Psalms are attributed to them, and thereby the songs that we even sing. It's more than possible that Jesus' disciples sang a song of Korah the very night in the upper room just before he left for Gethsemane with Jesus. The Bible doesn't tell us that. That's me speculating. But it's possible that they could have sung a song of Korah because their hymns were very prolific hymn writers. We even sing songs of the sons of Korah today. You like As the Deer Pants for the Water? Song of the sons of Korah. Be Still and Know? Song of Korah. Great is the Lord, greatly to be praised, a song of Korah. And those are just a few. There are many in our songbook that we sing. So, now that you know the rest of the story, it's time to tell it, but you already know it, so we'll have to put off whatever the rest of the story is until next week. Any questions? Any comments?